Hi boys and girls. Today we're going to continue with Frindle by Andrew Clements, and today we're going to read chapter 10. But before we start chapter 10, I wanted to remind you that good readers always keep track of their characters. And I hope that you are thinking of all the characters that we have met so far. We have the main characters, which are Nick and Mrs. Granger. And of course, I'm sure you remember that. And of course, we also have the principal, Mrs. Chatham. And we also have Nick's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Allen. And we have Nick's friends, Janet, and the rest of the boys, John, Pete, Dave, and Chris. And so I want you to remember about these characters, okay? Just kind of keep track of them. There are other characters that are secondary characters. They come out at the beginning of the story, but they don't come out later. Like, for example, Manny the custodian, or the third grade teacher and the fourth grade teacher. And so those are secondary characters. But the main characters that we have to keep track and focus on are Nick, Mrs. Granger, Nick's parents, his friends, the principal, okay? And so today we're going to meet another character in chapter 10. And this character is going to be important too because of her, something happens in the story as well, okay? So today's chapter 10 is called Freedom of the Press, okay? And so press, the word press, has it's a multiple meaning word, because press means like you press on something, right? But in this case, the word press has to do with news and radio, or with the TV shows and television. And so freedom of the press means that you're able to report things on TV or on the radio. So that's what chapter 10 is about. Well, that's what chapter 10 is called. And so let's find out what's going to happen on this chapter. It's called Freedom of the Press. And so this is where we meet our new character. So chapter 10. Judy Morgan was a reporter for the Westfield Gazette, the local newspaper. See, right away. So Judy Morgan is our new character, and she's a reporter. And she's a reporter for the local newspaper. And the local newspaper is called Westfield Gazette. Westfield was a quiet little town. There was the occasional burglary. The teenagers got rowdy once in a while, and there was some shouting at the town council or the planning board now and then. But mostly, things were calm and orderly in Westfield. And every Thursday, the Westfield Gazette proved it. So it's a small little town, and they have a little newspaper, and there's stories to run there, but they're not as interesting. It says sometimes there was like a burglary, or teenagers got rowdy once in a while, and little things like that. Okay. Ted Bell sold advertisements for the paper, and he had a daughter in fourth grade at Lincoln Elementary. So this is a person, Ted Bell. He's another character, but he is a secondary character. It's not. It's just going to be mentioned once, just right now. And so he has a daughter at Lincoln Elementary who's in fourth grade. He told Judy, the reporter, right? He told Judy that a bunch of fifth graders were making trouble and were not obeying teachers anymore. That there was something about a secret code word that they were all using. And by now, you should already know what's the secret code, or what's the word that they're using. Remember, they're using Frindle instead of pen, right? So that's the secret. And remember, even when they took the picture, they said Frindle, right? Because remember, that's the title of our book, right? That's the most important thing about this book. And so he kind of mentioned that to the reporter, and the reporter thought, that might be an interesting story. Let's see. And so he's telling Judy about this. And half of the students had been kept after school. And one day last week, including his own little girl. So he knows all about it because his own daughter had to stay after school. The only other story Judy was working on was about 18 new trees that were going to be planted along East Main Street. The trees could wait. This thing at the elementary school sounded like a real story. So the reporter, Judy Morgan, thought, this sounds like an interesting story, and I might get more readers to read the newspaper if I do this story rather than the one about the trees being planted. So Judy Morgan showed up at Lincoln Elementary School at 3 o'clock the day after Mrs. Chatham had been to visit Nick's parents. So this was the day after. The sign on the door said, "All visitors must report to the office," and she did. Obviously, when you come to school, even at our school, right, you can't just go straight into the school. You have to stop at the office. And so that's what Judy did. On the bulletin board outside the office, Judy saw Mrs. Granger's notice about the punishment for using the word Frindle. She stepped back 2 paces, aimed her camera at the notice, and snapped a photo. She read the notice once more and then stepped into the office. So remember that there's a notice right next to the office. And remember that it says that you need to not say the word Frindle. Mrs. Freed, the school secretary, looked up and smiled. "May I help you?" "Yes, I'm sure you can. My name is Judy Morgan, and I work for the Westfield Gazette. I would like to know about that poster outside, the one outside the office, the one about this word Frindle. Who should I talk to?" Mrs. Freed, right, the secretary, Mrs. Freed stopped smiling. She was sick and tired of anything that had to do with that word. For the past week, her phone had been ringing off the hook. If it wasn't a parent complaining about a child who had to stay after school, it was someone from the school board trying to get in touch with Mrs. Chatham or Mrs. Granger or Mrs. Freed. And so she's tired of all of this, and she's like, "Oh, another one, now a reporter?" Mrs. Freed pursed her lips, and narrowed her eyes, and she said, "You will have to speak with the principal. Let me see if Mrs. Chatham is free." So she's gonna go check and see if she can talk to her. She was. There isn't a principal alive who won't find the time to talk to someone from the local newspaper. The reporter was invited into Mrs. Chatham's office. Judy noticed right away that the principal was not comfortable talking about this stuff. When asked about the poster outside the office, Mrs. Chatham laughed and said, "Oh, that? It's nothing really. Some kids have been playing a prank, and it was time to put a stop to it." So she's just playing it off. She's like, "Oh, no, that's not a big deal. It's just a prank." Is it a prank? The principal's laugh sounded phony to Judy Morgan. "And did the notice put an end to the prank?" she asked. "I heard that a lot of children were kept after school last week. Would you tell me a little bit about that?" Remember, she's a reporter, and she's doing a good job on asking her questions to figure out really what's going on here. And so her first question was, I heard a lot of the children were kept after school last week. Would you tell me a little bit about that? Parents would like to know what's going on." Mrs. Chatham looked like a kid who had been sent to the principal's office herself. She squirmed a little in her chair and tried to smile. She said, "Well, we do still have a little problem, but it's under control. Mrs. Granger may have overreacted a bit. I don't think the children have really been trying to be disrespectful. They're just having some fun, and it's more like a difference of opinion." And then Mrs. Chatham went on to tell the reporter what she knew about the word Frindle and how it had become popular among the students. Judy Morgan took careful notes. Well, she's a reporter, so she has to take good notes, because when you're a reporter, you have to report the facts, and you can't put on your own opinion, because she's a reporter. She has to state the facts, and she has to name the source. And so she's taking really good notes, okay? It's kind of like when I tell you to take good notes, like right now when you're listening to this chapter, you should be taking notes if you can. That way when you go back, you remember some of the important things. And so that's what Judy's doing when she's interviewing the principal. Judy Morgan took careful notes. And when the principal had finished, Judy said, "Would you mind if I ask Mrs. Granger a few questions?" Mrs. Chatham said, "No, not at all." But Judy could tell that the principal wished that she would just go away. What could she say, though? Mrs. Chatham couldn't very well keep the reporter away from Mrs. Granger, because after all, America is a free country with a free press. So even if Mrs. Chapman said, "No, you can't go interview one of my teachers," in reality, the reporter can go interview one of the teachers, and the teacher can say, "No, I don't want to be interviewed." So, but that's up to the teacher. That's up to Mrs. Granger, not up to Mrs. Chatham. It's kind of like what she said. America is a free country with a free press. If Judy really wanted to, she would talk to Mrs. Granger sooner or later. It was sooner. In 3 minutes, Judy Morgan was standing at the doorway of room 12, looking at Mrs. Granger. There were about 15 children sitting at the desk, scattered around the room, busy writing out their 100 sentences. Remember, they stay after school to write their sentence. I am writing this punishment with a pen, right? She knocked, and the teacher and students looked up from their work. "I'm Judy Morgan from the Westfield Gazette, Mrs. Granger. May I have a word with you?" Mrs. Granger stood and came out into the hallway and closed the door. Of course, she didn't want the kids to hear. Judy could see past her and saw that every kid in the room was straining to listen. They wanted to hear what she was talking about. They're like, "Ooh, what happened? What happened? What's going on?" Judy noticed Mrs. Granger's eyes right away. Gray, maybe flecked with a little gold, and very sharp, but not hard or mean. See, just bright and strong. Again, you know, you can kind of know a person, but just looking at their eyes. And so even Judy noticed that Mrs. Granger's eyes are like, they're strong, but deep inside her eyes there's love. Like there's kindness, there's caring in her. Of course, you know, she's a teacher, but as a teacher, she also has to be stern and strict, but lovable at the same time. And so Judy can see that in her eyes. I'm gonna reread that. It says, as she noticed her eyes right away, gray, maybe flecked with a little gold, and very sharp, but not hard or mean, just bright and strong. The reporter didn't waste words. She got to ask the questions right away. "So I hear that you plan to stop the students from using their new word. How goes that battle?" See, here it goes again. Remember, we've been reading about this. It seems like it's a war of words. It's a battle. It's a chess game. And so even Judy says, "I heard that you plan to stop the students from using their new word. How goes that battle?" Mrs. Granger did not smile. She's like, and her eyes got even brighter. "First of all, it's not a battle. I am merely helping my students to see that this foolishness should stop. Such a waste of time and thought. There is no reason to invent a new word, a new and useless word. They should each learn to use the words we already have. But of course, all of this is just a silly fad. And when you add an E to fad, you get fade." So you see, let me kind of rewind here a little bit. Mrs. Granger says, it's not a battle, and besides, I don't know why they had to invent a new word, a new useless word, and besides, the kids are using it now, but it's just a fad. A fad is a little bit, it's a word that you use for something that is happening is now, but then it goes away. So she says, it's just a fad, right? So here, I wrote it here for you. I don't know if you can see. So it's a fad. And then she says, but when you add the E to fad, you get fade. See? So she says, just a fad, right? It's just something that is just going to go away. And then she says, so that's a real word. A fad is a real word. And then she says, but if you add an E to it, now it says fade. And fade, right? When something fades away, right? It goes away, fades away too. So remember, she's an English teacher, right? She knows all about words. She knows all about grammar. She knows all about spelling. She knows all these things. And so she says, they should each learn to use the words we already have. But of course, all of this is just a silly fad. And when you add an E to fad, you get fade. And I predict that this fad will fade. Judy looked up from her notepad and asked, any idea how it all got started? She's like, okay, well, how did it all get started? How did the students start using the word Frindle instead of pen? How did it all get started? Judy looked up from her notepad and asked, any idea how it all got started? Well, Mrs. Granger's eyes seemed to almost catch on fire. Here goes our airplane. You hear it? There it goes, there it goes. So I hope you're thinking, well, this airplane goes away. Who started this? Is there any idea how it all got started? You know how it started, right? Plane is gone. You know how it started, right? You know, Nick. So, any idea how it all got started? Mrs. Granger's eyes seemed to almost catch on fire at that question. She got kind of upset. And she said, oh, yes. Yes, I have a very good idea how it all got started. It was one young man's idea. A fifth grade student named Nicholas Allen. And now, you will have to excuse me, Mrs. Morgan, but for I have papers that I must grade. And with a brief, firm handshake, Mrs. Granger ended the interview. She's like, I'm done with this. She didn't want to talk about it anymore. But at least the reporter got one important thing, which is how did the word get started? How did the idea get started? And she says, oh yeah, I know. It was a young man's idea, a fifth grader named Nicholas Allen. The reporter didn't leave right away. She walked back through the hallway and sat on the bench outside the office so that she could look over her notes to make sure they made sense. So remember, she's reviewing her notes. It took her about 5 minutes. Then Judy stood up, put her notebook into her large black purse, waved goodbye to a frowny Miss Freed, and headed out the door. As she walked to the parking lot, 5 or 6 kids who had just finished writing their sentences for Mrs. Granger came out another door. Judy walked beside them, listening to them laugh and joke. Then she asked them, why do you kids keep saying Frindle? Don't you hate staying after school? So some kids are walking, and Judy's kind of walking with them alongside, and she's listening to their conversation. But I want you to think about this. It says 5 or 6 kids who had just finished writing their sentences. And remember that I'm thinking that those 5 or 6 kids has to be Nick and his friends, right? Because remember, there's Dave, and then there is Janet, and remember, so I'm thinking it might be them. What are you thinking? It says 5 or 6 kids who had just finished writing their sentences for Mrs. Granger came out the other door, and Judy walked beside them, listening to them laugh and joke. Then she asked them, why do you kids keep saying Frindle? Don't you hate staying after school? A boy who was almost falling over from the weight of his backpack looked up at her and smiled. It's not so bad. There's always a bunch of my friends there. I've written that sentence 600 times now. 600 times? Let's do some math. Remember that when you stay after school, you have to write it 100 times, right? Each time. So if this person has written it 600 times, so how many times have they stayed after school? 100 each time. It says, I've written that sentence 600 times now. So how many times have they stayed after school? Did you do the math? 100. Did you do 100 times 6? 600 times. So this person has stayed 6 times. There goes that airplane again. And then the kids said, Mrs. Granger didn't even look at their punishment paper anymore. Uh-oh. She's not even looking at their assignments anymore. They were sure because when you were supposed to write, I am writing this punishment with a pen, everyone was writing the word, I am writing this punishment with a Frindle, every 4th or 5th sentence, and Mrs. Granger hadn't said anything. One girl bragged, and she had written the word Frindle 45 times on her sheets today. She grinned and said, that's a new record for me. So you see, they are writing, I remember I was supposed to say, I am writing this punishment with a pen, but a lot of them are now writing, I am writing this punishment with a Frindle. And Mrs. Granger just doesn't even notice. Now, I'm sure that she's not noticing because it's a lot of papers to look at, right? And so she probably just collects them and puts them away and is not looking. And this boy named Nick, Judy asked. So she's talking to the kids and she says, what about this boy named Nick? Judy asked. Has he had to stay after school too? The kids giggled. And a tall boy with reddish brown hair and glasses, right? And a tall boy with reddish brown hair and glasses said, Mrs. Granger has kept Nick after school so much that everyone thinks she wants to adopt him. You see, who's answering this question? Nick. Because it says, a tall boy with reddish brown hair and glasses said, Mrs. Granger has kept Nick after school so much that everyone thinks she wants to adopt him. She's talking to Nick, but she doesn't even know it, the reporter. The reporter smiled and said, do you think that I could find Nick and talk to him this afternoon? The boy looked at Judy for a second and then said, I don't think Nick would want to talk to you right now. He might say something dumb and get himself in trouble. Then he grinned at his friends. I can imagine him, and I can imagine his friends giggling and smiling. The kids laughed and poked and punched each other and headed off down the block. Judy drove back to her office and started writing. The next morning, a brown envelope arrived at the Gazette office addressed to Judy Morgan. So an envelope came to her office. And below her name was written, Frindle Story. When Judy opened it, there was a class picture, the 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary School. Mrs. Granger and the 6 other teachers were standing at the ends of the rows, and the kids were dressed neatly, hair all combed, but there was something odd about that picture. So somehow, someone delivered the envelope with a picture of the 5th graders to the reporter because they want her to have a good story. The reporter looked closely and saw that each kid was holding a pen, a pen. And each little mouth was puckered in the same way. She was puzzled for a second, but then she said softly, of course, they all are saying Frindle, see? Because when you say Frindle, like say it, Frindle, she was able to tell the way they pucker their mouth, and it said Frindle, not cheese, right? Frindle. So she was able to tell that they were saying Frindle. She's like, of course, they're all saying Frindle. Written on the back of the picture in neat cursive, 3rd row, 5th from left. So somebody even gave her details. Look at the 3rd row, 1, 2, 3. The 5th from the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5th from the left. Judy looked at the picture, and there she saw the same grinning red-haired boy with glasses that she had talked to in the after school in the parking lot yesterday. So she's like, oh, that's the same kid I was talking to. She chuckled, she laughed, and she smiled. Well, 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 pleased to meet you, Mr. Nicholas Allen. So she noticed that it was Nick. And that's the end of chapter 10. So This reporter, Judy Morgan, is going to write about how the kids at Lincoln Elementary are using the word Frindle instead of pen. You remember, she has all her notes. She interviewed the principal, she interviewed Mrs. Granger, she interviewed the kids, and she even interviewed Nick without even knowing it. And now she even has a picture of the 5th grade class when the kids are saying Frindle, right? And so she has all of that, and it's ready to write her story. So when this is on the newspaper, I want you to think about, what do you think will happen when this reporter writes her story on the newspaper, and it's going to come out in the newspaper? So what do you think is going to happen when the story comes on the newspaper? What's going to happen? Okay, so don't forget to answer the questions, and I will see you next time. Bye, boys and girls.